Is this working? We all have our Verizon moments, so I wanted to make sure that I won't have mine in the middle of the program. I just wanted to welcome you all, and it is, as always, such a pleasure and privilege to be working with Women's Learning Partnership with my good an amazing friend Mahnaz and everyone else. She has this sort of a knack for finding and uniting and getting together amazing women from the world over, and that is what we're doing again. You have to excuse my voice. I'm not trying to imitate Lauren Bacall and speak in a sexy way, being hot. I just have a cold, and I might not be able to be with you for the whole program, but I would do anything for you, even have my voice hoarse. Anyway, I think that we've been having these programs and these collaborations for a long, long time, and they have always been important, but I think that this is a moment in time and in history, and not just in the history of other parts of the world, but also in the history of this country, the world over, where we are, it's an exceptional time. It's a time of transition, it's a time of crisis, and a lot of both good and bad things are happening at the same time. And that is why we need to rearrange and re-question what has been going on in the past in order to be able to understand what is going on in the future. And that is why the collaborations like the ones we have, and that is why universities like SAIS, but universities across the country, really need to have a lively and equal exchange with people who are in the field, with people who are connections to the realities that are going on the world over. And that is why I think that this meeting and then the meetings that we have with WLP are so important, not just for us, but for everyone else. And one of the things that I had been thinking before coming to this meeting was that why is it that every time there is a crisis, why is it that when there is a political upheaval, women become the first targets and victims? And this doesn't matter which part of the world you live in. It always happens that women are the most, the earliest targets and victims of violence. And this came to me last month. I was introducing Malala Yousafzai for this award she was getting for Amnesty, Art for Amnesty, and I kept thinking, what is it in a young teenager who has no weapons, who's very fragile and frail, who has been doing nothing but just writing about her situation? What is it in her being that makes her so dangerous? That these men with guns who are so powerful, cannot exist if she exists simultaneously. And this question came back to me in 2009 when Neda Agha Sultan, the girl from Iran, along with many other young girls in Iran, were targets of, again, the Islamic vigilantes and the Islamic regime, and they were killed. And this happens I'm sure that our panelists, each one of them, have examples from their own countries and where they come from, where this has happened. Why is it that actually, my friend Mahnaz, I'm sorry I keep doing this to you. You can start rolling your eyes and, pretending that you don't know me. But why is it that someone like her, who has never used a gun or used violence in her life, all of a sudden, when a new regime comes into birth in Iran, the Islamic regime, they begin by targeting women like her, and she goes into the blacklist for warring with God and spreading prostitution? You see, it is not just physical mutilation, but it is mutilation of words, it's mutilation of history. And so this was the question that I kept asking myself. And one of the things that I thought is the argument that the fundamentalists today bring, these repressive regimes bring, and unfortunately in the West, a lot of people also pick up on it. In the academia, they keep bringing this up, that they call this as their culture. that these things happen for a reason, because women in that part of the world are used to that culture. Now the question is, if it is their culture, why is it that you have to kill people in order for them to practice their culture? You know, women do not need to be jailed and flogged and beheaded and stoned to death and be target of guns. If they believe in what you say, they do believe. So obviously this is not their culture. And that is what I think gets the people who commit the violence, because these women, and the women who will be speaking to you today, and the women that we will see in this film, what they are doing which is dangerous is not because they have guns, it is not because they're using violence. They are doing something far more subversive and far more dangerous, and that is exposing this myth of power. That is what makes them so dangerous. And therefore, the violence against them is not out of the people who target them, it's not out of their strength, but in fact it comes out of weakness. And I think this is another myth that women break, that Taliban's guns, that the Islamic regime's torture chambers, that all of this power that the oppressive forces use against people, innocent people who have no weapon but their mind and their desire to be free, is out of fear. The fear that if what these women are saying is true, then things cannot go on the way it does. That is what is so frightening about these women. And I think that this is actually the great thing, because if Nida Agha Sultan, if in Iran today all of you walk down the streets the way we're sitting here, it means that the regime has changed. If Malala and thousands of Pakistani girls can go to schools, be educated, wear the same kind of clothing that they want, do what they like to do, then it means that something has changed, that the Taliban that targeted her is no more Taliban. And that is what makes it so frightening. And that is why women have the privilege of being canaries in the mine. That wherever you want to judge how free a country is, what the state of that country is, you go to its women. And that is how you judge where we stand today, where we stood yesterday, and where we will stand tomorrow. And I think this is very exciting, isn't it? When you look at it in this manner, then you're no more victims, but you are the ones who are bringing hope and change to the world. And it becomes a privilege to be targeted, because it means that you're dangerous enough to fundamentalists the world over, including this country, that they cannot tolerate you. One of you has to exist, and I don't mean physically, but the mindset. One of the two mindsets has to exist, and this mindset, we can tolerate them, they can tolerate us, and that comes from strength, because we can tolerate them. We're not afraid of them, they are afraid of us. And so, to make a very long story short, I don't want to go on and on. What I wanted to say, and I wanted to end with this part, was that, you know, it is easy to target Taliban. It is easy to target those very obvious cruelties. And sometimes in Western democracies, we feel so good about it, don't we? Look at what happened to them. It is them, not us. And it sort of gives us a sense of complacency. And I think what happens when you listen to what is happening here, it shows you that what the women from other parts of the world that are now involved in the struggle, as women in this country had been, as late as 1979, I remember when I was in this country, you know, nobody would have thought that Hillary Clinton would run for president. She was just a crazy feminist, you know. There was no hope then. The whole point that they bring you back is to remind us how fragile these liberties that we have are. But they bring back something else about us. And I want us living here to feel a little bit guilty and to think about this. And what they remind us of is the fact that the question we have to put to ourselves is that why should we always be confronted with extreme cases before we pay attention? Why is it that this young girl in Pakistan has to be killed? I mean, fortunately, she wasn't killed, has to be shot in the head. Why is it that Nida Agha Sultan has to be murdered on the web in front of our eyes for us to pay attention? When we pay attention only to the extremes, it is that we have not really believed in the struggle. And I think the importance of an organization like WLP and the importance of meetings like this is that they don't just bring you the extremes. Because remember, it is so easy in this commercialized world to market everything. And Malala's t-shirts are already all around. You can, submerge a person and a struggle to the extent that it doesn't become important anymore. We don't need t-shirts. We don't need awards. What we do need is paying attention to the fact that the struggle is not just an exception, that this just didn't happen to one person, that this is happening every moment. And the fact is that if we want to genuinely give support and have people in other parts of the world be free and secure so that we can be secure and free in our own countries, because there's no other way that we can be free and secure except for the rest of the world also feel secure and free. If we want that, then we have to pay attention, we have to understand, we have to read, we have to pay attention to the day-to-day struggle that is going on in every of these countries, to all the workshops, to all the problems, to all the problems that are facing every day, and they are fighting every day. And we should not wait for people to get killed in order to give voice to people who are fighting against the kind of laws that we have. That is our responsibility. And I just wanted to say that once you support these struggles, then you discover that this is not about religion, that Islam, in fact, here is as much of a victim as the women who are being victimized, that people who are being killed by the fundamentalists and extremists, the majority of them are, in fact, Muslims. And the women who are being victimized are, again, Muslims. This is not a fight against religion. This is a fight for freedom of choice. This is a fight for democracy. This is a fight against totalitarianism, and totalitarianism comes in all shapes. It comes in its Islamic sense, it comes as fascism, it comes as communism, it comes as Christian fundamentalism. They all have the same sort of features. And that is why I think that we should, in different universities, in our academia, we should let go of the old formulas and theories. We should not impose our theories upon the changing everyday reality that goes on today, that we should listen. We should not talk so much as I'm doing. We should listen to the others. And we should listen to those who are experiencing every day and let the ideas come from that sort of experience. And with that in mind, I want to welcome you, dear friends. You always make this place more graceful by being here. And you make us pose not just the world as a question mark, but ourselves. So with that, I'll drink to everyone. And thank you so much.
Hello. My name is Catherine Harrington. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Advocacy and Communications at Women's Learning Partnership and the co-producer of the film that you're about to see, Because Our Cause is Just. First, I just want to thank Azar and Layla Austin and everyone here at SAIS at the Foreign Policy Institute for all of your help facilitating this event and for partnering with us. We've been having events at Johns Hopkins for years, and they've always been wonderful. And so I thank you very much. And we've shown this this film several different times in different cities in the United States. It's been shown in different cities around the world, in Beirut, in Vienna, in Amman, in New Zealand, in Montreal, and a bunch of other places. But I'm especially excited today to be holding this event and showing this film because we also are very fortunate to be holding our annual partners convening. So we in this room have our partners from across the Global South that are inspiring women's rights and democracy and human rights activists that are here with us today. So I'm also very pleased to have you all here with us. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Azar. I couldn't agree with you more, and that women truly are the canary in the minefields, in the mines, in the minefields. Little appropriate Freudian slip there. That's part of the reason why we made the documentary that you're about to see. Many of our partner organizations at the national level are in the Middle East, North Africa region. And so in the wake of the transitions that were taking place, we saw and heard what was going on the ground that was oftentimes a very different story from what some of us were hearing in the media here in the United States and elsewhere, where we saw the incredible backlash against women's rights. And, you know, when you were speaking, it reminded me of a recent conference that I was at in the Washington area that was on democratic transitions, and the gentleman sitting next to me who works on Middle East issues introduced himself, and we work on advancing women's rights and democracy and countering extremism across the partnership. And so when I introduced myself and my affiliation, he said, "Oh, I didn't know we had a gender focus today." And I kind of had to bite my tongue for a second because the point that we are trying to make in this film and that you so eloquently just made is that the intimate link between women's rights, minority rights, and democracy and countering violent extremism, you can't have any of those things in the absence of each other. So whether you're talking about countering extremism or actually establishing a true democracy that respects human rights, women's rights is not a separate conversation. And so the people, the activists that you see in this film, the scholars, the experts, they make this point in the film, and it was something that we felt needed to get out there as quickly as possible. So we sought to make this film as quickly as possible, oftentimes more quickly than our production team would have liked. But we've been really touched and inspired by the reception that it's had around the globe. And so, you know, and sometimes audiences say, but now what can we do? This film is really intended to raise the dialogue and the discussion and make people start talking about these fundamental links and then to get inspired to do things. So after the film, we have several activists that are working on these issues and scholars that are going to be talking about the issues that are in the film. And we hope that you will really engage in a dialogue with all of us afterwards, because that's part of what this film is meant to do. And we can all start to think together about how we can both, not just in the region, not just where there's the Taliban, but here in the United States, where, you know, across the globe, where there's always a need for a reminder between the intimate link between these issues that we're talking about in the film, extremism, women's rights, democratic principles, and really human rights for everyone. So thank you so much for being here. I look forward to a really engaging conversation with the panel and then afterwards with all of you. In addition, there's a campaign that we launched in conjunction with the film called Stand With Women Who Stand for Democracy. And we're really just rolling it out. We've been rolling it out with screenings across the world and conversations about how we can take activism on these issues to the next step. So I hope there's information in the front, and we can talk about it more during the discussion. But thank you, and I hope you enjoy the film.
Our rights. We won't be quiet. We won't lie down.
It's enough! We want freedom!
So we're not going anywhere until our demands are met.
In 2011, a revolutionary movement ignited across the Middle East. People cried out for freedom, democracy, dignity, and demanded an end to authoritarian rule and corruption. Determination and hope filled the air.
We have an opportunity to build on this momentum.
I'm 19 years old, okay? And I'm here to fight for my freedom and for my country.
We have our rights, we're going to fight for our rights. This is our country and we are going to liberate our country with our hands. We can do it.
This was an extraordinary moment of history. There was no men, women, nothing about Muslims and Christians, nothing, everybody supporting everybody. As soon as this cause has finished, achieved, mission accomplished, then differences began to come.
Regimes held for decades crumbled. Others throughout the region watched with a wary eye. And women, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with men in the struggle for democracy, suddenly found themselves pushed aside when it came time to formulate new governments. Their voices silenced. This exclusion of women was not unique to the Middle East. Activists in other countries have had similar experiences.
Men have a way of marginalizing women when the struggle has been won. Because for them, it's about power, and power need not be shared. So women have to organize, because when we're organized, we become a force. And women need to be clear about this. We need not just fight for democracy. We must fight for women's voices in democracy.
A movement of democratization does not necessarily mean a movement that will include women in terms of equality in laws.
President Hosni Mubarak has stepped down, bringing his 30-year rule to an end.
These so-called revolutionary moments, that are moments of foundation of a new order, are very important in the sense that they offer an avenue of opportunities. They're very dangerous also.
I voted in the election, but those who come to power forget about us.
We wanted the revolution to produce freedom and dignity, but now we're back to square one.
Decades of authoritarian rule stifled the development of democratic forces, leaving little opportunity for political organizing. Houses of worship, on the other hand, shielded by religion, thrived as centers of fundamentalist political activity.
The progressive forces wanted a free, democratic society, but they had really no experience of how to get there, how to make that kind of society happen. What are the basic structures upon which such a society would be based? And no time. You can immediately make people go and drop a vote in a ballot box, but you don't have time enough to form the infrastructure so that that vote is thought out and decisions are made on the basis of the goals clearly stated.
Determined to create a theocratic state, religious conservatives had the established networks, the organization, and the financial resources to quickly mobilize and fill the leadership void. Resources that were readily provided by other fundamentalist states in the region. They also had a very simple but important message. God is on our side, and a vote for us is a vote for Islam.
We're here to apply God's Sharia. As long as we love God, we have to follow His Islamic law.
I don't understand those who talk about meaningless philosophy and principles and other nonsense. Our demand is clear. It is to apply Islamic Sharia.
With a long history of rigged elections and the rapid emergence of new political parties, people turned to what they knew, what they felt they could trust, their religion, and the Islamists promised solutions to all of their society's problems. Consequently, they won elections in Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco, putting them in charge of drafting new constitutions and laws that, once written, would be hard to change.
Women in particular have a lot to lose if there are non-democratic, Islamic-oriented parties seizing the power and imposing rather than allowing a pluralist voice to be heard in the country. Then what women have gained can be seriously challenged and in some cases withdrawn, because rights that are given can easily be taken.
When people are in opposition, what they say and do is completely different when they are in power. When Khomeini, for example, was in exile, he kept saying that the clerics are not after state power. But of course, we all know what happened when he tasted the intoxicating taste of power. And they took control of every aspect of not only the state, but every minute details of people's lives were dictated by the Islamists.
The power of fundamentalist conservative forces has always been pushing back the rights of women. The women belong to the private space and men to the public space. They concentrate on complementarity, which means women are complements of the men, but not full independent human beings on their own. So they resent and reject anything that brings women to a position of equality. In the countries in transition, I think the role of women is a test. Because if you cannot see full equality for women, you may be sure that you can't see full equality for any minority.
The Middle East North Africa region is comprised of many diverse countries with different economies, different governing and legal systems, different local cultures. But in nearly all of them, women do not have the same rights as men, either socially or legally. Historically, this was true across the globe. In Europe, women did not have the right to vote until the early to mid-1900s. In the United States, it wasn't until 1920. While many regions have made notable progress towards equal rights since then, most of the Middle East North Africa region has not.
Advances in education and access to healthcare for women has not led to higher participation or higher representation of women in politics and in the economy, where we know this is where the power is. And so you are in a situation where patriarchy prevails, where institutions are patriarchal, governments are patriarchal. If you think about all this together, you realize how much women's lives, women's bodies are controlled by this patriarchal system.
And nowhere is that more evident than in family laws. Heavily influenced by religious law, they determine nearly every aspect of a woman's life. The right to hold a job, even the type of job, the right to marry, the right to divorce, property rights, education, inheritance, child custody, even the rights to pass on her nationality, all in the name of custom and tradition.
Islamist-inspired governments don't seem to have any trouble with laws changing as you become more modern and engage in an industrial and globalized world. So they change commercial laws, they change economic laws, they change laws regarding politics, but when it comes to women, suddenly it is only Sharia law that you have to follow, and Sharia law as interpreted by a certain very elite group of clerics.
Contrary to the revolutionary calls for freedom and democracy, fundamentalists have been pushing to enshrine Sharia law into their new constitutions, further advancing the trend of using religion as a source of legislation rather than principles of equality and human rights.
We have prepared a complete Islamic constitution, and it contains nothing else than Islam, and it is not affected by Greek, Persian, or Indian philosophy.
This not only threatens women, it also affects minorities and leaves legal interpretations to a small group of religious leaders.
We have made many gains in the past era. We hope they won't be taken away from us, like the right to divorce. For many years, women suffered in courts. Why do they want to strip us of that right?
Intent on turning back the clock, religious fundamentalists not only want to take away a woman's right to divorce, they're calling to reinstate practices like polygamy and female genital mutilation, practices that bring significant danger and harm to women.
The rule that limited the number of wives to one is against Sharia law, and it should be banned.
I like Jalil's opinion about having not one wife, but two or three. I think this is right, because Sharia law says so.
In Egypt, newly elected conservative Islamists are calling to lower the age of marriage for girls from 18 to as young as 9 years old.
Violence against women is very much linked to women's overall status in society. So it's not just the harm done, which the governments are very happy to accept as harm done because they can be benevolent and find ways of preventing, protecting women from violence. But the challenge is to insist that it's not only a matter of harm done, but women's subordinated position is what is at stake here. So unless the patriarchal structures are challenged, women will always be a target of indiscreet forms of violence.
We are stripped of our dignity when we use public transportation.
It is used in every conservative societies to oblige women not to be part of the public life. Because if you are part of the public life, that means men can sexually harass you.
Hundreds of protesters have gathered outside a central courthouse in the Tunisian capital Tunis to support a 27-year-old woman who has been accused of violating indecency laws after she was allegedly raped by police officers. The case has highlighted fears that the traditionally secular country could be falling under the influence of Islamist fundamentalists.
Since the revolutions, acts of intimidation and violence against women in public demonstrations have increased across the region. Some have even been committed by government forces.
This video shows a young woman being beaten and stripped by soldiers.
Others by gangs of young men.
A young student journalist was being subjected to the most horrendous sexual assault by a mob of men.
And most are not prosecuted, sending a very troubling message that women in public are fair game, particularly women activists.
It's totally obvious that some of them intend to scare women away from the square.
Most of the time, they form a long chain, moving together, their hands on each other's backs like a train.
They attacked the girls, they ripped their clothes off and sexually assaulted them.
We went to rescue the girl. Suddenly all of them took out weapons, switchblades and knives, and those that didn't have weapons took off their belts to beat us with.
We received a lot of reports about the incidents of sexual assault that are taking place, and we believe that they are all executed in a similar way, and we feel that the assaults are organized, but that's not going to stop us from going to the square, because we have to expose the people behind this.
In societies like Libya, for example, and Syria now, women are raped, women are really victims not only because they are citizens in a country that is facing a conflict, but also because they are women in this society.
In Egypt, a whole group of women's rights activists have been fighting for many years to bring some marginal improvements to the legislation. They had, for instance, a success with the no-fault divorce, the khul. However, these were appropriated by the ruling regime, and they became Suzanne Mubarak's law, and created what you might call a first lady syndrome, so that the women's rights agenda became appropriated by the national machineries. So as a result, the detractors can now claim that these were simply the apparatuses of a corrupt regime.
This is what happens with the backlash in terms of trying to disempower women, to tell them that they have no agency, that they don't make any difference, that they can't change their own lives. So denying those changes and denying the role of women in bringing about those changes is one of the strategies that they use.
With the region's strategic location and abundance of oil, geopolitical issues have had a long, complex history, burdened with the legacies of colonialism and Cold War politics. Historically, international powers have focused on political stability and commercial interests, often at the expense of human rights and democracy.
Both towers of the World Trade Center hit by aircraft.
Then, in 2001, geopolitical concerns took on another dimension.
After 9/11, national security became a number one concern, and human security became marginalized. And women's groups, women's rights issues particularly became targeted, not only because states' willingness on this platform has diminished or the priority has gone down, but the whole security discourse created new hardline political actors to become more effective throughout the world.
Women's rights issues and geopolitics may seem poles apart, but they're not. I think that a lot is going to be sacrificed and overlooked on the altar of geopolitics, by which I mean successor regimes in the MENA region. I think that as long as they toe the line of being market economies, following a broadly sympathetic agenda to the powers of the West, nobody will look very closely at what they do internally.
And that puts struggling democracies and the future of minority and women's rights in jeopardy.
International support makes a huge difference. If people around the world understand what is at stake, that women's role is completely interconnected with the possibilities of living in a modern and democratic society and a developed society with economic well-being, and that this kind of society is indispensable to peace and safety for everyone across the world.
Activist Amal Abdel Hadi says it's time Egypt's majority population, women, get equal rights.
No discrimination on any basis, not on gender issues, not on religious issues.
تتصدى في قوى الإسلام السياسي المشهد وهي قوة.
The main challenge in Egypt is similar to other Arab countries where political Islam now holds power. These forces don't allow for a genuine participation of women. There is also the added problem that the Islamists have a wide community outreach, particularly in poorer areas, making women's participation especially difficult.
In Tunisia, fundamentalists tried to include the concept of complementarity in their new constitution to legally define a woman's role in society. Activists, however, organized and defeated that measure. But in Egypt, women were blocked from the Constitutional Committee altogether in a power grab by Islamist parties.
The way that the country has been ruled so far did not really allow for strong participation or inclusion of women in decision making. We thought that with a new democratic Egypt, this would be over.
And in Jordan and Morocco, countries that didn't experience regime change, women's rights activists have been seeking constitutional reforms for decades, only to face familiar resistance.
Many of our recommendations were taken into consideration, but in the last moment, they removed one word, which was essential for women's rights, which is equality between all citizens despite of their religious, language, or race, or sex. They removed the word sex. And some of them, of course, they said, all citizens means all men and women in the country. But if it is the same, why you remove it? So it is really very worrying that the additional powers are still trying to play this superiority of men over women in the society.
But in Morocco, activists were able to counter long-held conservative religious arguments.
Nous avons pu nous fonder, nous baser, utiliser les lectures qui a été faite par d'éminents.
We were able to utilize and base our case on interpretations made by eminent Muslim scholars who have proven that you can live in Muslim countries while being modern countries and still have access to fundamental liberties and rights.
Their efforts resulted in reforms that not only guaranteed equality between men and women, but also stated that international law supersedes national law when it comes to these issues.
Le fait qu'on reconnaisse dans la Constitution l'égalité.
The clear recognition within the Constitution that men and women are equal, particularly in the civil code, which is where individual liberties are determined, that recognition was a tremendous step forward for us. There is a political will, but also mobilizing the women's movement is very important. We know how to work together, and we also know how to build alliances and create strategies to be able to have an impact on the street and also on the decision makers.
Achieving constitutional change was a huge success, but getting these rights implemented is still a challenge. And with Islamists winning recent elections, activists are certain to face more resistance.
With the rise of the PJD, the situation of women will become even worse. We want moderates, but these Islamists are not moderate. They all hold extremist views on women.
Donc c'est ça en fait ce qui est intéressant à observer actuellement au Maroc, c'est comment ils vont gérer ces contradictions.
What's so interesting to observe currently in Morocco is how they will manage these contradictions between a constitution that clearly defines values and their own values, which are closer to Islam, cultural specificity, the family, and so on.
La famille, etc., etc.
I think they have to evolve because otherwise they cannot manage these contradictions and these paradoxes. Morocco has progressed. We cannot go back 20 years. So they will also have to evolve.
RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat has gone a step further. In a speech in Indore, he said that women must restrict themselves to household work.
And in Madhya Pradesh, a BJP minister, Kailash Vijay Varghya, said, rape is punishment for women who cross the limits of decency.
This shy 8-year-old girl has become the face of a national battle against extremist ultra-Orthodox Jews.
Israel is outraged by the story of Naama Margolis, a second-grade student who fears walking to her religious girls' school because of ultra-Orthodox radicals who have cursed and spat upon her for dressing in a fashion they consider immodest.
The political field has changed because now there is a much stronger presence of religious radicalism. And while we talk a lot about Islam, sometimes we forget about Christian radicalism with evangelical churches, on plural, with Catholic Church, and with their sacred alliances in many issues. And again, particularly when women's body and decision over her body is the target.
What does that make her? It makes her a slut, right?
After that huge firestorm developing after Rush Limbaugh's controversial comments on his radio show about a Georgetown student in the center of the battle over contraception and religious rights.
Now we see in the United States, with the rightist movement growing and putting down the issues of women's reproductive health, women's choices, and making most unbelievable statements to young women who never even knew that there were issues about use of contraceptives. They believed that that was a right that women had received and they would retain it forever. So we must have a place of defending what we have achieved.
The structures of power, the way women have been treated, the way women have been positioned, is really very similar in spite of the differences in style and in implementation. And the only way that we can change that situation is by solidarity across borders, across religions, across cultures.
Where is the women's voice to define a different understanding of religion? Now is the time.
What is most important is to rebuild powers on the ground and to empower women and men who are really pro-democracy, who are really fighting for their rights, to be united and to be working together to see some changes.
Democracy is a work in progress and it needs support, especially in places where the forces against democracy are very well organized and very resource rich. So we need help to support the development of economic and social progress and skills building.
I mean, I think all of these are issues that women have to be involved in. And
that kind of thing is a lot cheaper than wars. It's a lot cheaper than any kind of conflict. And it's something that is to the benefit of all.
It takes years of working with local communities, building capacities on what is participatory leadership, what really is democracy, before you get to this moment where a group of women can actually visualize it as part of their lives, before women would stop and say, well, you know what, I can't take abuse anymore, or I will not vote the way my husband wants me to vote. This is not a mechanical process. This is really breaking vicious circles that have been passed on generationally and that are reproduced not only in the household, at schools, in the media, and we know that this is incredibly difficult.
To get more women participating, what is required is pressure, mobilization, discourse, interactions, coalitions, to be active in syndicates, professional syndicates, labor unions, media groups, whatever, so that they are present there not just as women, but as women professionals in their own rights. So opening channels and getting alliances with men groups is quite critical. There is no escape from that. Otherwise, the women's movement will remain an isolated, excluded movement from the mainstream of political formations of the countries.
Let us be honest and say that fundamentalists have invaded the virtual world way before us. So now more than ever it is important for us to be there, to be out there, making sure that this tool is accessible more and more for our own constituency and more for increasing that constituency.
And we have to begin to link our absence from the democratic process
with real outcomes in the lives of our people. In Nigeria, 60% of our women will give birth without a birth attendant. How is that possible 12 years into the democratic system that we have? We must link the absence, the inability of our government to address the needs of women to the fact that women are not there at the decision-making table.
Women's rights should be institutionalized.
Media, of course, plays a very important role in order to see the link between women's rights and human rights. Unless this link is made between women's rights and the rights of all citizens, for a democratic state that respects everybody regardless of any differentiation, the democracy will be truncated. It will be democracy for men and not democracy for women, and that's not democracy.
Look at what has happened to the opposition movement in Iran. Now you have Iranian men who have finally understood that you cannot separate the issue of women's rights from the issue of democracy. But I wish that it wouldn't take 30 years of theocratic rule to get that simple message across to the other countries of the MENA region.
Je crois que l'atout principal, c'est que nous considérons que notre cause est juste.
Our main asset is that we consider our cause to be just.
Du fait que notre cause elle est juste, eh bien,
and when one is sure that one's cause is just, we can defend it to anyone.
As I look into the future, I'm hoping that men will look into their hearts and that they would know that democratic process has no value if women are not part of it. And therefore they have to also extend themselves in order to build coalition with women so that true democracy that's built on equality between men and women becomes the real life of the people in the region.
My greatest hope actually is no discrimination of any kind, because it dehumanizes people, and that every Egyptian feel an equal, useful, productive, powerful human being.
It used to be said that Arab people were a resigned people, but they took to the streets, they protested. And I think all governments to come will have to take that into account. And we can only go forward. Despite the challenges, despite everything that's going on, I am certain that we will move forward.
We're showing the children that they have a voice, they can be heard. Because a lot of them were always brought up as, no, you can't talk, no, we're scared, no, he's going to come after you. Now we're pushing them to have a voice and say what they think and say how they feel.
My greatest hope is with a new generation, because I think we now have a new generation that has been raised with expectations of having choice and having dignity.
We will not be silenced and we will not be kept away. It's amazing what we're seeing here, because we never thought women would actually go out in Libya.
Almost all of these women here are protesting for the very first time in their lives.
We have seen them on television screens, on the internet. We have heard their voices, and they do not want to be ruled in the manner of their parents' generation.
We want to take this country into the future.
We're not going to go back.
Even if the men decide to give up, the women will continue with the revolution.
We know our cause is just. We are committed. We are inspired. We will fight. And we will get our rights.
Okay.
We're all famous faces. All in the movie. Celebrities here.
All the movie stars. Are these lights necessary? We need the lights, Abdul?
We can.
No?
I can turn them down.
That would be good. If we don't turn the lights off, I'm going to confess. Thank you. First, I would like to really thank Leila Austin and Azar Nafisi for their continued partnership. Our partnership with Johns Hopkins has been a very productive and satisfying ongoing dialogue. And of course, WLP's group, they're all basically always involved in whatever we do. Catherine, who spoke earlier, is the co-producer of the documentary, as well as a bunch of other things. I don't know whether Kimberly is here, who's had a lot to do with organizing the gathering of these wonderful people here, all of our partners who are among you. And Stacy Scott, who's the there she is out there. She is the event manager, financial manager, and also supervises all our events. And the other wonderful people, I don't want to name all of you, but I'm Mama Afghani, by the way. And I just wanted to basically introduce our wonderful chair of this panel, Soraya Obaid, who has been so many things to so many people around the world. But most importantly, she's the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. And right now she's serving on the Shura Council of Saudi Arabia, her native land. And this is a first in the entire history of that country for a woman to be in that position. And not just any woman, this particular woman. It makes a lot of difference which woman. And so we're very proud of her and very proud to have her in that position. And, you know, Women's Learning Partnership focuses on participatory, democratic, interactive, respect-based leadership training, which is the basis for democracy and for the development of a healthy society. And I think Soraya is a fine example of that kind of leadership. But I don't want to take too much of your time. You have the stars from the movie. The film was made before the recent events in Egypt and some of the other countries, and they will bring you up to date as to what has happened since and what they think of the prospects for the future. As Mr. Dickens said at one point, this is the best of times and it is the worst of times. The best of times because it is actually the first time that certain limitations, certain structures have fallen, and there is opportunity, there is an openness, there is a possibility. And in that sense, it's a very exciting time. And it's the worst of times because, unfortunately, because there hasn't been institutions and civil society organizations and the culture of interactive decision making, and there is urgency, you know, there's not time. Some countries have had time to experiment, to build, to develop. These events are happening in places where there's a lot of forces and there's not time to develop those things. So it is a difficult and challenging moment. There's going to be all sorts of opinions there. I can't leave the podium without telling you about mine. I'm almost psychotically optimistic. So I don't know how else to explain it. I think that the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, and then the uprisings in the Middle East, and then the new uprising in Egypt, and then of course the experience of Turkey, all of them brought to the fore the forces which I believe are the future of that part of the world, and possibly elsewhere. They're the young people who are educated, who are connected, and in the Middle East, North Africa, many of the women are the majority of the university educated people, 60% in many of the countries, including Iran. So these forces have come out. They have expressed their will and their wish. They are not getting up every morning and thinking of religion. They have the same values and the same wishes and the same aspirations as young people anywhere else, and they have the means to communicate. And I think that sooner or later, and we hope sooner rather than later, these forces will come to the fore and will be able not to just say what they don't want, but to speak to what they do want. And what they do want is going to make a better world for all of us. At least I hope so. So anyway, without taking any more of your time, I'll ask Soraya to introduce the rest of the panelists, and we hope we will have a very interactive conversation about all of these issues immediately afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahnaz, for the introduction, and thank you for setting the theme for the discussion that will take place. But before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to say 2 points. The first one is that there is, not only in the Middle East, but worldwide, there is a generational change that's taking place. And I think it's important to emphasize this generation. What my mother accepted, it's not what I accept, and it's not what my daughters are accepting. So I think this generational change is very important. I come from Saudi Arabia. I was brought up in that country to a certain extent. But I remember my father sent me away to school when I was 7. And later in life, when I asked him, why did you send me away to Egypt at the age of 7 to go to school away from my family? And he told me, so I don't want you to be dependent on your husband as your mother is dependent on me. I want you to make your own decisions about your own life. And I think this change is a very important, the intergenerational change is quite important. The second point I want to make, and that's based partly on what Azar has said, but partly on my career as a UN person. As we see in the whole idea of the Western conscious, the feelings for the women of the developing countries who are suffering. Yet at the same time, the issue of women is used as an objective of war. Iraq was attacked by, or was occupied by the US. Part of the thing is to liberate the women of Iraq. The women of Iraq were not liberated. Neither is the country liberated. Afghanistan is the same, and so on. So the issue of the freedom of women should never be used as an excuse for war. There are two separate issues. If you want to invade, you invade because there is oil or whatever, but not to liberate women. It's a quite a different issue. So I think the consciousness of the West has to also think of the women who are being bombarded and killed by drones right now. It's not just that Malalai is an example. There are many Malalais in the world, but there are much more who are being killed by drones for women and children. So I think this formula, the conscious of the West, has to also be conscious of the other women who are dying for, and then you can, if you open the Pandora's box of Palestine, then you know the tragedy of women and war there. I will stop here but I thought I wanted to react to that. I'm very passionate about this issue because I have lived through many wars, and I know, and if you haven't lived through wars, you don't know what wars mean. We will begin. There are four speakers. It's going to be a story. Each one will add to the story some similarities, some differences. We will start by Egypt, because it is a very special case. Then we'll go to Morocco, because change there has taken a different form. Then we will go to Lebanon, where always wars are fought on its land, and it has nothing to do with the issues there, but it is impacted by neighboring wars. And then we come to Turkey, but with Turkey also we're going to hear other more of a global issue discussion. So we start with Dr. Inas Shafii from Egypt, and she's the executive director of the Forum for Women in Development. And basically, they work on exchanging gender and development research, analysis and training, and capacity building. So she's very much in the Arab world, so she's very much a hub for knowledge of gender and issues of women in the region, but she will be speaking about the experience of change in Egypt. Inas. 10 minutes, and I'm going to get out my watch. No. And it's going to be 10 minutes.
It's right up there.
Okay, well, it's up there. So we allow lots of discussion and dialogue. Okay.
Thank you, Thoraya. And I would like to thank WLP International, and also would like to thank you all for attending this event. I would like to start with historical background about what was happening in Egypt. 2.5 years have passed since the breakout of the first wave of the Egyptian revolution, which was preceded by years of party, trade union, and people mobility under the leadership of young people, both gender. People mobility was initiated back in 2005, demanding the change. Ever since, the Egyptian mass united together to achieve change, and the period between first wave of revolution and the second wave, which was in June 2013, has been a lot to the Egyptian people. The first transitional period, led by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces in Egypt, SCAF, witnessed an increase in the religious stream authority and has greatly influenced by the people, by the political of people, by employing religion. The extremist religion people have used to influence people to vote for the Islamist as a choice of halal or right versus forbidden or haram. Also, I would like to mention that this phase witnessed a lot of military trial of victims, and extreme violence was used against people, especially women. The phase was followed by another democratic transformation after slim success of President Mohamed Morsi, the MB candidate in the presidential election. The period of June 13, 2012 and June 13, 2013 meant a lot also for the Egyptian, as they witnessed events that the Egyptians have not and will not ever forget. Let me mention some of them. The first 100 years, it was 100 years, by the way. The first 100 days, President Morsi failed to fulfill his promises according to his electoral program. And also it was followed by poor choices while selecting his assistants and the state leader, and particularly his prime minister, who made bad choices also of his cabinet. From there on, a new era began, where they sought to appoint MB leader in the higher ranks in the state and replaced the existing leader with those loyal to the MB without any consideration for their efficiency. But the one who considered the real change in the Egyptian history, it was in November 2012, when President Morsi issued a constitutional declaration by which he gave himself as a president a right to retain full authority in which his decision cannot be become irrevocable. This in addition to so many events, to many other incidents and detail. In short, we can claim that we had a year full of failure, raising prices, energy problem, and a feeling of the president full prejudice to the MP, and general feeling of disappointment due to the change in identity of Egyptian state and its diversion towards an MB identity. This all led to overwhelming demonstrations that have outnumbered those of the first wave of January 2011, where 30 million citizens revolted and 22 million signed a support of ousting to the president. I would like to highlight who was the identity have played effective role in this period. The first was the army institution. The Egyptian army is a high-class national institution which has practiced its role as a national institution in charge of protecting the state. It is true that SCAF has made the wrong choices during the transitional period following the January Revolution and has poorly managed the state. However, the Egyptian army has responded to the challenge, responded to the calls of Egyptian people and did not let them down. Had it been for the Egyptian army support, Mubarak regime could not have been ousted in 2011, nor could Morsi regime in 2013. Also, I would like to highlight the role of the National Salvation Front, which was formed on November 2012 after the Constitution declaration by Dr. Morsi. The front is formed from 35 political parties and movements, and all belonging to both liberal and left-wing ideologies. The grassroots and youth movements played such a very important role in this period, and I would like to highlight the role of rebel or tamarrud, which considered one of the most renewed youth movement, as it succeeded in collecting millions of signatures to withdraw Dr. Morsi, and has successfully called for and organized the June 30 demonstration. By the way, one of its members was selected to participate in the 50 members committee for amending the Egyptian constitution. Also, Al-Azhar and the Egyptian church have a very important role in this period. Of course, the civil society organizations also was highly recognized in this. After all, the Egyptian people had played very good role. Among them, women has participated and has her own contribution in both participating in the event, in several events, in streets, in unions, and everywhere women participated. And another kind of participation and another kind of groups of women were never participated before, such as the mother of the killed people. They participated very highly and has various demonstrations. And also, I need to tell you that so many women has injured and killed in the events. For the tools of democratic transition, we have the social media, social events, and in social event, I would like to tell you that Egyptians have introduced and creative ways of expression their objection. For example, at the time President Morsi declared a curfew in Canal City, people starting organizing football championship that started with the curfew house. Also, Egyptians used very cleverly the fun and jokes all the time. They have signature campaigns, also literature, art, music, and revolutionary thing. Very good. The most important achievements till now. First, the fall of the MB came as a result of the second wave of the revolution, which brought people to realize that policies and religion don't mix. The successful implementation of the roadmap, which was